This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to Israel and books and ideas as well as many other things. I am your host, Dalia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Halper.
This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy.
Our guest today is Yohanan Plesner. He's the president of the Israel Democracy Institute. Plesner served as a member of Knesset for Kadima Party, where he also held a string of executive roles. And he was also an international businessman and strategic consultant. Israel's upcoming 70th anniversary is an excellent opportunity to reflect on the accomplishments of the much-touted only democracy in the Middle East, as well as the challenges that it has been facing and will be facing in the future. Yohanan Plesner, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Let's start with a general question. Do you think that Israel is an exemplary democracy?
Israel at 70 is a phenomenal success story. We look 100 years back, we see 60, 70,000 Jews that the majority of them just entered the land of Israel, then just occupied by the Brits from the Turks. No institutions, tiny economy, no armed forces. And fast forward 100 years, almost 9 million people, a startup nation, OECD member, strongest military force in the region, rejuvenated the Jewish people. So we have a lot to be proud of. And probably the most important, the vast majority of Israelis are proud to be Israelis, see their future here in the state of Israel. So we have a lot of positives to work with, alongside some serious challenges.
Well, I want to know about what those challenges are, because actually what we want to ask you about, one of the things we want to ask you about...
we're Jews, right?
Of course.
You heard this.
Well, 80% of us, 76% of us are, the rest are not. You have this project that you're going to be launching, I should say, around Independence Day called the Israel Democracy Pavilion. And I wanted you to tell us about the project, but I really want to know about why we have a need for this project. After all, you wrote recently in a Fathom article for the Fathom Journal, after 70 years, Israel is a vibrant, dynamic, and resilient democracy, as you said. If we're so vibrant and resilient, why do we need a project to celebrate and strengthen our democracy? But tell us about the project as well.
The Democracy Pavilion actually symbolizes, in a sense, both our strengths and the challenges that we alluded to. It's a project that we initiated in collaboration with the Tel Aviv municipality. It will be the first station of a Tel Aviv Independence Trail that is going to be launched within a couple of weeks. And the logic is, perhaps for those of you who are aware of the Boston Freedom Trail, that's the Israeli version of the Freedom Trail, a number of stations that celebrate our independence, our democracy, our sovereignty, our achievements. And the first station will be the Democracy Pavilion, erected by the Israel Democracy Institute, and it is there to celebrate the core values of the Declaration of Independence. This document that has been signed in a very important moment, though, in the afternoon of when the state was founded. And it's the closest document that we have for constitution, or at least for principles of a constitution.
Then why doesn't it mention the word democracy?
It mentions the core values that constitute what we call a substantive democracy. So in this respect, it's a very important document that defines both Israel, the historical narrative of what Israel is about, why we have the right to establish a nation state of the Jewish people here in this part of the world, both the biblical rationale, the historical rationale, the international legitimacy based on the UN resolution. And alongside with that, it also depicts the vision of how this state should look like, based both on the vision of our biblical prophets, but also on principles of international law. And this beautiful document that was written during a war for the very existence of the Jewish state, when our very existence was at question. It's a very enlightened and generous and benevolent document that while it establishes Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, it also ensures full equality to all its citizenship, freedom of religion and freedom from religion, and all those important principles that we hold on to, and that ever since the state has been founded were the principles that held us together, allowed us to achieve those great achievements, and enabled us to overcome moments of crisis.
These principles and values are what makes up the substantive democracy, as you called it, which is really the essential issue here. A substantive democracy as opposed to what you call the hollowed-out democracy, which focuses on majority rule, not really on the values of democracy, but rather on the processes, on the procedural aspect of democracy. I want to go back to the Democracy Pavilion because whereas the procedural aspect can be showcased pretty easily, right? You have the parliament where there's majority rule. You have, other institutions such as the Supreme Court. How do you showcase substantive democracy? How do you communicate it to the wider public?
So you're right to emphasize that today, I would even add, unfortunately, we're witnessing a watershed or conflicting attitudes about what Israeli democracy really means. While around 85% of Israelis are committed to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state and are committed to Israeli democracy and are proud of it, an increasing number, more by the way among the politicians than among the broad Israeli people, are adopting a reduced or a narrow definition of what our democracy means, which is for them majority rules, majority can decide everything, which is another way of putting it is a tyranny of a majority. A substantive democracy includes separations of powers, an independent court and judicial system that supervises the executive branch, a strong legislative branch, and it also includes values, what in other places such as the U.S. we might call or label constitutional values, such as basic freedoms, freedom of speech, equality, rule of law. And this set of basic constitutional values is an integral part of what being a democracy. And here lately we're seeing some erosion, at least also in terms of some of the public assertions of our political leaders, an erosion to some of those basic constitutional values. And I think one of the purposes that Democracy Pavilion is there to serve is to showcase, celebrate those values and their importance to our national character and to our ability to achieve those great things that we have achieved.
Why do you think this assault on the constitutional principles of democracy is happening now? Why now? At the time, as you said in the beginning, Israel is really at its prime. It's economically prosperous like never before. The security threats on Israel are at the lowest ebb, perhaps in its entire history. Yet, while Israel was really at risk, under siege, physically, democracy prospered and really nobody in any shape or form contested the democratic makeup of Israel. But just now, when it's so-called Israel is so resilient like never before.
Well, it's a great question, although I will try to challenge some of your premises.
It's good that you're challenging them because I was going to challenge some of them too, but you're our guest. No, you are our guest. You get to do it for me.
So it's true that the Declaration of Independence is really a miracle, is such an impressive and deep document that really defines our national character. But to say that Israeli democracy at the foundation of the state was more robust than today would be misleading.
I think so too, and I think we have to mention that, I know I was going to let you do the work, but we have to mention that a large portion, a minority of the citizens, the Arab citizens at the time, who are now 20%, were living under military rule for the first 20 years of the country. I'm not saying good or bad. Obviously, I don't think it's a good thing, but it's certainly not the most democratic thing. So we're happy.
And the emergency regulations as well.
So Israeli media became more free and more independent, freedom of speech. Definitely our Israeli Arab citizens who are basically at the foundation of the state, at least at the constitutional or declarative level, they were supposed to gain complete equality, but we know that immediately after the war that was not the case. So Israeli democracy made huge strides forward in terms of ensuring independence of the court, independence of academic freedom. The whole legislation that ensured that was legislated in the 50s. So it was built layer by layer. So that's an answer to one premise, but it's true at the same time that we're seeing increasingly, I would say in the past decade or so, 2 decades, and increasingly in the past decade, 5 or 8 years, growing and increasing attacks on some of the values and institutions that we have considered so far part of our national consensus and that are not supposed to be under dispute.
Can you just give us a couple of examples for our listeners?
And I ask myself sometimes the same question. I'll try to share with you some of the answers, but those attacks and initiatives began when I served in the Knesset back in 2010. I remember some of those legislations. So I will share with you some of them, and then perhaps we can talk about some of the factors that bring them about. So I think one cluster of initiatives are attacks against the independence and the authority and the system of nomination of judges of our judicial system, and mainly the Supreme Court in its role as what we call Bagatz, in its role as
the High Court of Justice.
A High Court of Justice. So this is for sure one cluster, and another cluster are a series of initiatives that are supposed to target the equality, participation and decision-making of representatives and citizens from the Arab minority in Israel. Another cluster of initiatives has to do with tampering with what I would call the rules of the game. If it's special basic laws that are tailored, changing the threshold of what is required in order to split up a party, changing a basic law of what is the size of the government, creating personal laws in order to not allow people to run for politics. Basically, everything is up for grabs. Everything is about politics. There are no agreed upon procedures and rules of the game. In a democracy, procedure is substance. Procedure is not just a set of rules that can be changed. Part of the substance of a democracy is respecting the procedures. And perhaps the final cluster is our initiatives that have to do with freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Again, attacks to narrow the freedoms.
But why do you think it's happening now? Because some people think that perhaps in the balance between the democratic and the Jewish character of Israel, democracy has gone too far?
Yeah, actually, I want to add to that question. Recently I was speaking with a young Israeli man who's a right-wing voter, not extreme right. I would say my guess is that he's probably a Likud voter. And he said, there's a Jewish democratic equation in the country. It's very important, but the democracy side has just gone way, way too far, and now we need to balance it out and restrain it and emphasize the Jewish side. What would you say to a voter like that? I mean, you said 85% support Israeli democracy, and I agree with you, but I think there's a lot of people like that who think, of course I support democracy, but hey, all this has gone too far.
Well, so I would say that this voter has been a great consumer of baseless propaganda that apparently is quite effective and successful. If you repeat the same things over and over again, even if they're wrong, even if they're not based on any facts, over time, a good share of voters or constituents would adopt them. Basically, if we go back to the factors, I would say there are a number of factors. Some of them have to do with what's happening today in the world. Israeli democracy is not detached from other trends that affect liberal democracies all over mainly the Western world, Europe and North America. And here
pretty much everybody except Portugal.
Here we're seeing an increase in populism, increase in searching for the enemy from within as a remedy for many of our woes and troubles, increase in the negative use of social media. Social media has some great developments, such as lengthy, serious podcasts.
Exactly. Where would we be without social media?
But it also opens up avenues for misuse, as we're all well aware of lately. So those are some of the trends in growing economic disparities as a result of globalization and its effects, and as a result, people looking for anti-establishment solutions and politicians that are riding on that sentiment. Those trends affect also our democracy and are creating a fertile ground for populism, and in this respect, populism and the tyranny of a majority come hand in hand. But there are also some unique aspects and characteristics that have to do with Israel.
I'm interested in what you said about people that you tie globalization and the social and economic inequalities to the rise of this anti-establishment issue, because in fact, who's the establishment? I mean, the Likud and Netanyahu himself has been in power for a grand total of over 12 years and now over the last decade. And yet people who are socially marginalized or economically marginalized, you're implying, support his approach and his government's approach, even though they appear to be the establishment for having been in power for so long. And I want to bring up one of the quotes in one of your recent articles where you said almost every tribe in Israel, and we're talking about the different social communities, sees itself as both the majority and the minority, both powerful and under threat at the same time. I feel like that is linked to what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, I mean, Israeli society increasingly is fractured. If we had a hegemonic group in the past that sort of led and set the tone, increasingly we're seeing what the president labeled, and I would imagine that you dealt with it in other chapters, what the president labeled as the four tribes of Israeli society, the ultra-Orthodox, that is today perhaps only 11% of the population, but 25 to 30% of the Jewish first graders. We have the national religious group, again, around 10%, but much greater when it comes to the kids. Arab minority of around 20%. And the secular tribe that is even, if we make an effort, we can dissect it into at least two tribes of, you would say maybe center and periphery, more educated and less educated. And of course, there's the fifth tribe, diaspora Jews. And when you look at those tribes all have a vision for how the state should look like, not only for them, but for everybody. So that's the uniqueness of the Jewish state, is that if you're an ultra-Orthodox, you have a halachic vision of how the state should be run. And it's not only for one's own tribe, but you want to make sure that others adopt. So those visions are both broad, but also perceived as threatening. And we see that 55% of secular Israelis are fearful that their own personal behavior, conduct is going to be under threat by religious conduct of rabbis and ultra-Orthodox politicians in power.
Religious coercion.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think this crisis emanates from the absence of a constitution? In the same article, you talk about the erosion of, quote, the basic constitutional values in Israel. And I have to say that when you were member of parliament, your party, Kadima, had one of its flagship policies was to try and draft a constitution for the state of Israel. To what extent do you think that the absence of a constitution is really the root of evil?
I think that if at that formative moment 70 years ago, when alongside the Declaration of Independence, a constitution would have been agreed upon, or the declaration and the decisions that were made afterwards defined that within a year after the establishment of the Knesset, a constitution will be agreed upon. We've been waiting for 70 years, so it's the longest year.
In fairness,
ever.
they did try.
They did try, and we continue. We're now building it chapter by chapter. But if we had a constitution that would have defined our core values, if you will, our national character and national identity as manifested in our core values, the rules of the game, basic institutions, separation of power, that would have been a major asset to our democracy. I do not think that at this point in time, given the levels of fear, suspicion, fragmentation of Israeli society, I don't think that moment is ready. We at the Democracy Institute, we prepared a blueprint for a constitution that we think provides a good balance to resolve the main issues. But I think now we can move forward, perhaps issue by issue, chapter by chapter, but there's no political viability to come up with.
So that ship has sailed. You think there's really no chance in the foreseeable future that Israel
Not in the
has?
foreseeable future, perhaps in a future moment of crisis, which I hope will not
But do you think
occur.
that a constitution would have been able to safeguard all those principles of substantive democracy that you're
I
talking
think
about?
that a constitution, and if not, a series of arrangement, both legal, social contracts that will define the relationship between the different tribes, will define the common civic denominator between the different groups of Israeli society. What is it that we share? How do we see our common future? And institutions and policies, and that's also something that we're working very diligently in order to develop at the Democracy Institute, mechanisms and institutions that will bring us as Israelis together. Perhaps offer one example. I mean, why should me or my secular son, if you will, meet the first national religious person only in the military? Because we go to separate schools. I mean, from North American eyes, it would sound unimaginable.
I think we should stop for our listeners and explain that Israel has different streams of education for these different religious communities and for the Jewish and Arab community. And they're, in some ways, you could even go so far as to call it a segregated system.
Yeah. So how can we complain about having a system that is fragmented if we institutionally designed it to be in this way? So my son, by the design of our institutions, my son would meet the first national religious person in the military, the first Arab person perhaps in higher education, and the first ultra-Orthodox perhaps maybe somewhere in the workforce if things will change, or maybe never. So, and we're all one small, tiny society. It doesn't make sense. So the remedy is an entire web set of policies, changes in institutions, for example, in the education system, but not only that will bring us together and allow us to create this common denominator alongside with allowing us each to safeguard or hold on to our unique version of our identity.
Let me ask you about another one of those institutions that you mentioned, the political parties, because in Israel we have many parties that represent very specific sectors. We have parties that represent Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, even though it's not by design, religious, ultra-Orthodox, Arabs versus Jews. And you say there needs to be some sort of a change from sectoral parties to something else, more civic-based. How would you do that? Would you outlaw them? Would you say they have to have at least maybe publish a civic policy program? I mean, how do you erode this system of sectoral parties technically?
Well, you're absolutely right. And if, to ask this master question that I've been asked initially, which is how do you explain what are the unique characteristics of Israel that create those challenges to our Jewish and democratic nature, to our constitutional values? So one answer of those unique was the fragmented nature of Israeli society and the suspicion between the different groups. That was answer number one. Answer number two, it has to do with our dysfunctional nature of our political system. And this is something that can be remedied, it can be rectified, and one needs to understand Israel has a very unique, extreme case of proportional representation parliamentary system, which means that every small tribe, group, interest group can define its own party and gain representation in the parliament. If you will, if you want to have an analogy in the American case, Cuban Hispanics from Florida, Hispanics from Central America, all of them, that type of Jews, that type of Catholics, that type of economic group, regional group, each, if America had our system, it would have fallen apart for sure.
But we've tried to address that. In other words, we've raised the voter threshold so that a party needs 3.75% to get into parliament. Now, it sounds like the problem goes beyond just raising the threshold. It's something to do with the fundamental nature of parties.
Beyond, yes, but there is also an institutional, structural element, and if we create the right or the proper institutional incentives, this can be dramatically changed. And the one change that we're pushing at the Democracy Institute for initiating is a definition of that the leader of the largest party is prime minister. If we change the system of how a prime minister is selected, that we just define that the leader of the largest party is prime minister, that would create a dramatically strong incentive for voters to vote for one of the large two parties and for parties to build broader umbrella alliances that will cause them to come together, and it will basically recreate a two-block system. you add a few small amendments for that would make it quite difficult for the Knesset to just disintegrate itself, and we would again create a stronger incentive, a prime minister with more stability, with a big party behind him or her, a much stronger certainty that he or her are going to be there for 4 years, and a strong incentive within those major umbrella parties to negotiate the differences within Israeli society, rather than an incentive to build one's own tribe and to the trumpets,
beat the drums
of one's own tribe,
of identity.
Instead of
the
that,
drums of identity politics.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of that, it would create a different incentive for how me and the ultra-Orthodox member within my own party, how do we negotiate and find and make compromises?
Now we've reached our favorite section in every podcast, and that is the elephant in the room.
Which is
the Palestinian question.
Okay.
To what extent do you think that the fact that for the last 50 years out of the 51 years, actually, out of Israel's 70 years of existence, there has been at its doorstep what is by any means an anti-democratic and illiberal project of the occupation of the Palestinian territories? To what extent do you think that it has affected Israel's democratic resilience?
Let me also add to that question, just to bring it back to the Democracy Pavilion. As you point out, it's modeled on the Freedom Trail. And when I think of the word Freedom Trail, I think of liberation and freedom. And I think, what are we trying to liberate ourselves from here? Are the Jewish people still trying to liberate ourselves? Or are we looking at the population next door who are not living free lives? I mean, how can we understand Israeli democracy in that context?
Well, again, this is another factor that definitely, I would say, puts pressure on Israeli democracy. There are some major unresolved issues that, as long as they're unresolved, they do not have a benign influence on our democratic resilience, but rather adversely affect it. One of them is the question of religion and state. We had the famous status quo. And now this status quo that is the major differences are beginning to surface and rip up our agreements and institutions rather than help contain them. Another one has to do with the lack of resolution with respect to the Palestinian issue. Part of the attacks on the Supreme Court and the fact that there are those who their project is to erode the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is because the Supreme Court says as long as Israel controls those territories in what we call an army, a belligerent, we hold on to it.
The army term is belligerent occupation, so I have been told from the IDF.
Belligerent occupation, which is the international law term that we are using for holding on to the territories. As long as this is the arrangement, and it's supposed to be an interim arrangement, there's a role for the court to ensure that we abide by international law and so on. Those who their project is to settle the land, mainly the strong lobby of the settler group, they see the Supreme Court and its independence as the last check on their ability to fulfill their project. And in this respect, they have a strong incentive to delegitimize the court and to minimize its authority. So I do see some relationship between the lack of decision-making on the question, on the Palestinian question, and on the resilience of our democracy. And there's another aspect that is related, but not directly, is the fact that we are the only democracy that is facing a security existential threat. And obviously in any democracy, in any country, when you ask one's citizens, if you want to weigh basic democratic and civil freedoms versus security interests and calculations, any society would always prefer security over freedoms.
Wait, but what is the existential threat from the Palestinians?
I said it in a more general manner, that Israel is a democracy that is still facing an existential threat. This, again, creates another burden, strain, source of pressure on our democracy. With respect to the Palestinians, it's the fact that there's an ongoing friction between a civilian population and Israeli soldiers that constantly creates dilemmas, and the population would always prefer, our soldiers, our security forces, and would allow for very wide margins of error, which again is where the dilemmas arise.
But it seems in a way that that system is being prepared to weaken, the institutions of justice, almost in a way precisely in order to create a situation where Israel politically allows the continuation of this sort of rule over the Palestinians.
I think that it's connected both to the question of the nature of our electoral system, because the strongest lobby in the Knesset is the lobby of the settler movement, that both has some issues with the Supreme Court, and then one creates an entire ideology and saying that the court shifted the balance between Jewish and democratic, which is baseless. And the other aspect is that it has proved a tremendous effectiveness in mobilizing as a group, as an interest group, mobilizing for action within some of the key political parties, namely Likud and Beit Yehudi, Jewish Home, that basically there are two primaries parties, and the settler lobby is extremely influential at the levels of those parties.
So the real miracle is not the fact that Israel was established as a liberal democracy in 1948. It's actually the fact that it has remained a liberal democracy for 70 years, despite all this unbelievable strain.
Not only remained, but developed. I mean, again, the picture, it's a beautiful, rich mosaic of fantastic achievements alongside major challenges that so far we have overcome in a very impressive manner. But I wouldn't take anything for granted. It's day in, day out work to ensure that Israel remains strong, Jewish, and democratic.
And this is what we're here for.
Gilad, you're so optimistic today. I'm much more concerned about that Israel is increasingly no longer a liberal democracy, or that it's on the road to becoming what the Europeans are starting to call illiberal democracy. And I hope I'm wrong. But on your optimistic and my pessimistic note.
Yes. We will wrap up. That was Yohanan Plesner. He's the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, which is an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israel democracy. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalom, our producer. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review.
Then write one.
And also a good one, of course.
Total freedom of speech.
Absolutely.
You can write anything they want.
You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts for you. Check out our archive with over 400 interviews.
If you like what we do, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.